Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live stream. I'm so happy you've chosen to spend your time with me and Pessy this morning as we talk about 5 things we can think about as we support grieving children through the holidays. Um, I'm Andrea Dorn, and I'm a mom. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I have been working in social work with adults and children and families for over a decade. And I'm also the author of the Mindful Steps series, which is one of my biggest passions. It's a growing children's book series that consists of mindfulness informed how-to guides for kids. And you will see my gender neutral series character throughout our discussion today. In order to write my most recent book, which is a grief and loss how-to guide for kids, I have spent the last year really immersed in the literature surrounding grief and loss and healing. Um, Grief and loss touch all of us at some point, and working through bereavement can really become a life-changing time. Kids' developing minds struggle to understand and process the finality of loss. So they really need support from us to help them work through these tricky feelings and the tricky feelings that come with grief. We've had several recent tragedies in the United States and the world filled with loss, a pandemic filled with loss. And I think the US Surgeon General has estimated that more than 140,000 children in the US alone have lost a grandparent or a caregiver in the pandemic. Um, I think the holidays in particular can be a tough time for kids and families because these are the times we gather with friends and with family. So the absence of someone that we care about or that we love mixed with, images in movies or on social media of other families spending time together can really make that loss feel more apparent. And because kids grieve differently than adults, this topic is a pretty important one to talk about. So before we get started, we're going to move to the next slide. I think it's important to recognize that there is no one size fits all way to grieve, nor is there a list that will adequately encompass the support that someone needs to fulfill this really complex task of grieving a loved one. I think the reality of grieving during the holidays is that the goal, a lot of the time, is to just make it through. And that's going to look a lot different and feel a lot different for each person and each family, and even each person within one family. So when I think about my job as a therapist or as a caregiver, it can really be helpful to anchor my decisions and my actions to an overarching goal in supporting grieving children through the holidays. And this is a goal that I can kind of come back to again and again and check to make sure that my therapeutic or my family decisions are aligning with this goal. And I encourage families that I work with to do the same, to create a overarching goal that feels right for your family that you can keep checking back in with. So today we can practice that by considering that the main goal and the main thing we're working towards today in supporting kids through the holidays is creating a safe space for them to express grief feelings while gently allowing them to kind of explore moving forward and finding a life of meaning without their loved one. So making it through the holidays is not about healing grief. It's not about not experiencing grief. It's about working through the potentially triggering emotions that the holidays bring. And we're going to talk about that right now in 5 ways that you can work towards this goal. So let's get started. The first thing that I want to talk about is probably the most important thing, and it's really the foundation of everything else that we'll talk about today. And this is the importance of a caregiver self-care and self-compassion practice. The research tells us that grieving children tend to do better when their caregivers are doing well. But caregivers are in the trenches. Many are grieving themselves. And especially during the holidays, there tends to be an enormous amount of pressure on caregivers to fulfill holiday expectations of sometimes their kids, sometimes family members, sometimes friends. Um, so supporting caregivers in doing well, and I use that pretty subjectively, is really encouraging, if you are a caregiver, prioritizing consistent self-care and or self-compassion, excuse me. Um, and this is probably one of the best ways we know how to support grieving kids. You have to put on your own oxygen mask before you can help others, right? Self compassion and self care can provide some emotional stamina to help caregivers really get through and ultimately have even just the tiniest bit more space and energy to help their kids. And this practice also models to kids that self care is important. It's an important thing to practice. So when we think about self compassion, um, we think about treating ourselves or treating yourself the way that you would treat a dear friend, right? So in grief, this means slowing down, being kind to yourself, giving yourself grace, developing a supportive mantra to remind yourself that you're doing enough. Um, Kristen Neff is a great resource for self compassion. Self care during grieving encompasses basic self care practices with the emphasis placed on kind of to the best of your ability. So, making sure you're trying to get adequate sleep, nutrition, exercise. But I think during grief, self care can also include things like accepting extra help from others, taking more breaks, saying no to events or setting boundaries, um, making time for expression of grief, going slow or resting, taking time for yourself. It's important to think outside the box and really determine, what things feel best for you and what things feel most manageable for you or for those that you're working with, and then making those practices really intentional. Um, as a therapist, I like to make sure that I'm checking in with caregivers during the holidays, maybe a little bit more regularly than usual, just to really specifically discuss how self care is going, and trying to validate whatever experiences they're having during that time and during their practice. Okay, let's head on to the next tip. The next thing that we're going to talk about that is essential in grief and loss, but especially on the holidays, is allowing time and space for feelings and all feelings. And this can be a tough one because our own feelings and the feelings of others are not always easy to experience. And if you've ever experienced grief and loss, and I'm sure many of you have, you know that grief feelings can pop up at any time, really with no rhyme or reason. And they can even pop up many years after a loss. And a lot of times people don't realize that. I have a lot of people that I talk to that say, well, it's been a year. It's been 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Why am I still having a problem with grief feelings? And what we know about grief is that it lasts forever, but our relationship with it can change over time. But really, we can be activated by even the smallest reminder of our loved one. So, a holiday song, lighting a candle, a certain smell, just walking down the grocery store aisle. These things can trigger our nervous system and activate an emotional response inside of us, sometimes big, sometimes little. This activation is true for adults, but it's also true for our little people, our little kids. However, I think for kids, the activation looks a little bit different because kids don't often have the words or to describe their feelings. And a lot of times they don't even realize that their feelings or the awareness of that their feelings are being caused by their grief. So kids often express grief behaviorally or somatically in their body, or a lot of times in their play. So we need to be aware as caregivers that it can be helpful to go slower during the holidays, to accommodate and make time and room for play and for possible big feelings, which again may be seemingly unrelated big behaviors. Um, and to really care for and validate any body aches or pains. And this is true in the family setting, but also in the therapy setting. You know, during the holidays, I think there can be a tendency to rush, especially when you're trying to push through. We have to get to grandma's in 10 minutes. I only have 1 hour left to get the shopping done, or, slowing down or attending to this crisis doesn't fit in the treatment plan. Um, it can be helpful to enter the holidays with the expectation that there will be delays. Everything might not get done. So really go slow and expect delays. And something that we can do, when this happens and, when you're able to, is to allow the process of a feeling to take place. And this is where the power of presence comes in. As caregivers and parents and professionals, I think one of the most powerful tools that we have in our toolbox in general, but especially when it comes to grief, is just using our presence to be with kids. And this can help them to even possibly co-regulate, with your kids. So we're not fixing it. We're not giving advice. We're just being fully present. We're riding the wave of the emotion, and emotions have beginnings and they have ends. And so we're sticking in there with our child, and we're just really being with them for the duration of whatever emotion or behavior is happening. Maybe listening if they want to talk, but not always jumping right to fixing it. So this can be incredibly validating and healing for a child. And again, we can extend this practice or this idea of giving time and space to allow the riding of the wave of the emotion, to ourselves too. So the other thing that I think is important to talk about when we think about allowing, time and space for feelings is that while grief brings up challenging feelings during the holidays, there are also some really wonderful feelings that happen on the holidays, like joy and love and wonderment. And it's important to be present for and allow those emotions and feelings as well. Some grieving families that I talk to actually welcome and are comforted by the holidays because it provides a really welcome distraction, and time to be together with people they really care about. So, regardless, when we allow ourselves to be present with emotion, and when we kind of try to pendulate back and forth between allowing our grief feelings and also allowing positive or, even just neutral feelings to come up from the holidays, we allow our kids and ourselves and our brain and our nervous system to have an easier time navigating grief feelings. So allow time and space for all feelings. Okay, the next thing that I'd like to talk about is the importance of tuning into your child and prioritizing connection over the holidays. And this could really extend to, also connection with yourself and others. But, of course, we're gonna focus on your child right now. So grief is a very isolating thing. It is for adults and it is for kids. And connection can be a comforting tool to regulate your nervous system. So, if you're the primary caregiver or parent, it can be helpful to support your child by really dedicating at least 15 minutes of complete, undivided undivided attention time with your child, each day. And of course, you can spend more than that. But I find that 15 minutes is typically a really manageable amount of time for the people that I work with to kind of have this undistracted, undivided time. So I like to encourage that number as a starting point. Every once in a while, and again, depending on your child, important during this time of connection to check in and see how they're doing with grief. However, I think it's also important that your times of connection aren't always centered around grief. So some lighter ideas for connecting that I've mentioned on my slide are the ings. I like to call them the ings. So get moving. And I could really dedicate an entire slide to get moving because this is such a helpful tool in grief and loss. Move your body, get thinking, get laughing, get curious, get reading, get playing. Kids grieve through play and through their behavior. So the more we allow them to connect to time with others and allow them time to express themselves, the easier it is for them to process their feelings. And also, a lot of caregivers really experience a lightness when they're able to let go and be playful. Something that I run into sometimes with parents is that kids don't want to connect or they don't want to talk about grief. And so, what can be a really helpful tool in that case is using parallel play or just simply playing next to your child or reading next to your child or doing whatever activity they're doing next to them to and just kind of seeing what comes of that. A lot of times kids will connect. Otherwise, they feel a nervous system regulation even just by having, again, that presence. So tune in and connect with your child. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is holiday traditions. And this can be a really tricky subject for some families. Maintaining traditions surrounding the holidays is a really personal choice for each family. And there are a lot of factors that go into deciding which traditions feel best to participate in. An exercise that can be helpful for kids and families is to set up a designated family meeting to discuss holiday plans. So, ideally, we would consider this exercise before whichever holidays are important to your family or the family that you're working with. We've already passed, Thanksgiving and Hanukkah. But the idea is to facilitate or encourage a really light family meeting. Maybe order some food, sit down, plan to watch a movie afterwards. Really make it an open space where you consider each person's opinion. So that includes your kids, where you consider which activities feel good to participate in this year and which boundaries you may need to set. You can even give yourself permission to cancel the holidays if that's what feels best. So, write down this plan, revisit it each year, and kind of see how it changes over the course of, the time without your loved one. During this exercise, it can also be helpful to consider new ways to stay connected to the person who died. Again, this will look very different for each family, but there are many ways to commemorate your loved one. Lighting a special candle each year, creating a memory tree or table, volunteering in honor of the person who died, filling a stocking with small gifts your loved one would have liked, and then giving it to someone. You can really get creative with your families and find ways to celebrate your loved one that speak to your family. And kids really often enjoy participating in these activities. So it can be a great way to commemorate your loved one and also do something that's fun and kind of create almost a new memory with your loved one. During this time, don't be afraid to laugh and cry during these traditions, during this conversation. Don't be afraid to talk about the person who died. Children really benefit from these opportunities to know it's okay to talk about the person who died without fear that they're causing anyone pain or feelings of distress. And I did create, so there's a couple of handouts that I've created, and we'll talk about the next one in the next slide. But one of the handouts that I created is an activity around this idea of purchasing some items to gift to someone else that maybe your loved one would have enjoyed. And Rachel, I think, is posting the link for those in the comments. So you can check those out as a resource and as an activity to help kids kind of create new traditions around the holidays. All right. So our last tip for today is preparing before events and giving your child some control. So giving kids the roadmap for what to expect can allow their nervous system to feel more secure as they navigate new or stressful times, especially without someone in their life. And this is really the premise that my books are created from. So giving kids the roadmap for what to expect and what's expected of them during these developmental transitions. And even if kids don't get it right away, what we're doing is we're laying a foundation to which they can really anchor to and grow from. So when we think about holiday events, there are a few things that we can talk about beforehand to help them with this anchor. So the first thing that we can talk about is what to expect leading up to the event and what to expect at the event itself. A lot of times, parents and caregivers think this is just sort of an obvious thing, but it can really, again, help kids to feel more secure when they know what's going to be going on. So what do we have to do leading up to the event? Where are we going? Who's going to be there? Will there be food? Will there be music? How long will you stay? Will there be any expectations that they need to know about beforehand? Really outlining what they can expect and seeing if they have any questions or thoughts about this plan. If possible, maybe giving them the option to opt out or choose something else. It's important to kind of give control when we're able to, again, in order to help their nervous system feel more prepared to go into whatever event you may need to go into. It's also important to talk about potential grown-up reactions. I think one of the most often overlooked, but possibly distressing things for kids in grief and loss can be really the unexpected reactions or the non-typical reactions that they see from others. Maybe dad looks a little bit more mad. Maybe mom doesn't have as much patience. Maybe grandma is crying. This doesn't mean we shouldn't express grief feelings around children, but it does really help for kids to understand that these feelings are okay, that they might happen, that they're normal, and that they're connected to grief. When they know what to expect from others, again, they're able to feel more secure themselves. And finally, it's important to help set kids up with coping skills and maybe even an exit strategy. So determine what your child has control over in this event. So pick one coping skill that they can practice and maybe offer an exit strategy for when they're feeling overwhelmed. Can they have space alone in a bedroom or outside? Is there a person that they can talk to? Can they give you a secret signal when they're ready to go? Again, have this planned out ahead of time so everyone knows what to expect. And again, it can be helpful to keep checking back in with your child during the event just to make sure that, things are going okay. So I've created a worksheet again that you can use to talk about a specific plan for an event that you're going to. And you can either just use it to facilitate a conversation, or you can actually fill out the discussion prompts that are on the worksheet and use it as a visual. A lot of kids, especially ones that are of reading age, like to have that visual. They can keep it in their pocket so they can kind of pull it out and know, okay, this is my plan. So again, I think Rachel is sharing that for you in the comments if you're interested. So let's take a moment to recap. Our goal in supporting grieving children during the holidays is to create a safe space for them to process and express grief feelings. And during that time, we're moving towards exploring the idea of moving forward and finding meaning in a life without a loved one. And again, we're going to do this by focusing on caregiver self-care and self-compassion, encouraging our children and the families we work with to really slow down and allow all feelings to come and go. We're going to think about creating positive and meaningful connection with grieving children, and by discerning which holiday traditions feel best to continue and what might look like to start new ones. And we're also preparing and allowing our children to have some control. The end goal in most grief and loss literature is to come to a place of acceptance and, maybe even find meaning in the life we're left with. And this can take time and years. And, you know, I think we can remember this goal and this anchor, and we can kind of morph it to feel right for our family. But when we encourage children to feel and play and just have their behavioral responses, we can really use the holidays as almost an opportunity for them to create this meaning and acceptance over time. That is the ultimate goal in grief and loss. So, that's what I have for you for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you found these tips to be helpful, or at least reinforcing to what you're already doing. I'm not going to be answering any questions right now, but I have included my contact information and my website. So you can find me at andreadorn.com, or you can email me at andreadornmsw@gmail.com. And I'd be happy to answer any questions there. I also love to stay connected, so you can find me on social media at Mindful Step Series or at mindfulness.mom, and on Facebook at Mindful Steps. I hope you'll check out my newest book. It's called When Someone Dies, and it's a children's mindful how-to guide on grief and loss. And it's designed really to help therapists and caregivers talk about grief and loss and the path to healing in simple and concrete ways. And it includes many of the concepts that we've talked about today. It's available for pre-order now. It's available on Pessy, and I believe it will be available on Amazon soon, but it will be releasing March 22nd. So I hope you'll check it out. Happy holidays to all of you. Take good care of yourselves. And again, thanks for joining me.